Welcome everybody to this BSI and ISO webinar on the current and future challenges in occupational health and safety management and how standards can help. In this section, we're going to look at the future of occupational health and safety management standards. There's quite a broad range of topics we're going to discuss. Before we get underway, I would like to go through some basic housekeeping. This is a listen-only webinar. You will not be able to speak, I'm afraid, and it is being recorded. We do encourage you to use the Q&A function, however, to talk to our panelists, to ask questions, and also let us know about any technical difficulties you may be having so that our team can help you. Please don't wait until the end to ask questions. Do it throughout, and I will ask the panelists your question as appropriate as we go along. This is a CPD recognised event, so please request your certificate via the feedback survey that you'll receive afterwards. And you'll also then get the slides and access to the recording. So without further ado, let me introduce you to myself and to our panelists. Panelists, would you like to turn your cameras on? My name is Sally Swindred. I work for BSI, which is the UK National Standards Body, and I'm also the Committee Manager for the ISO Technical Committee 283 on Occupational Health and Safety Management. With me are some esteemed colleagues from that same committee from across the world. Unfortunately, we can't see Liani. You can see her picture, but we don't have a camera today, so we'll have to cope with that. And Liani, I hope you make your voice heard. So, Troy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sally. My name is Troy Winters. I am the Senior Health and Safety Officer for the Canadian Union of Public Employees. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada, and I am the co-convener for the TG6 of the 45,000, reviewing 45,001.
And Vic, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sally. Really nice to be part of this panel. I'm Vic Toy. I actually have well over 35 years of experience in health and safety in government as well as industry, but probably the most significant role that I have, and perhaps the reason why I'm on this panel, is that I've been involved with 45,001 since the beginning, and have actually served as the US head of delegation for input into development of this standard, as well as all the other ones we have, including the small guide for businesses.
Thank you, Vic, and we will definitely talk more about all of these as we go through today. Horacio, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Sally. Good morning to all of you. My name is Horacio. I live in Argentina. I run a very small consulting company at home. I have been participating in ISO standards since 1991, and now it's my turn in health and safety management standard. It's a pleasure to be part of this meeting. Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to have you here, Horacio. Thank you for joining us. Liani, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and so thank you very much for introducing me. My name is Liani Detroit. I'm an accreditation specialist, health and safety at the United Kingdom Accreditation Services. Much like my colleagues, I have been involved in health and safety for a number of years. In my case, 20+ years. I'm an IOSH fellow, and I have also been involved in the development of ISO 45001 since 2014. A member of HS1, and then also a member of TC283 Working Group 6.
And Liani, you beautifully demonstrated something I'd forgotten to say so far. We're already talking in numbers and acronyms. Can we please try, all of us, to remember to speak in words, because not all of our attendees will understand what HS1 is, for example, which is the UK National Committee on Occupational Health and Safety. It's very, very easy for us to slip into jargon and into standards talk. So please, attendees, if you do not know what somebody is talking about, put it in the question and answer box and we will stop and we will explain. and we will do our very best to talk in normal language and not in standards language. Okay, let's get started. Vic has already mentioned ISO 45001, as has Troy. You may well know that this is the Occupational Health and Safety Management System standard, the standard that sets out requirements, and often the core standard that is used out of our portfolio of documents from the technical committee. So, Troy, you mentioned that you're working in a new task group on this, but ISO 45001 went to ballot last year. We asked all of our national standards bodies if they wished us to begin revision of this standard, and they said no. So why are we working on it?
So thanks, Ali. That's a really good question. It's a question we've gotten a few times, actually, from a number of countries. So what we're doing in TG6, Task Group 6, is we're going back to a lot of leftover work from the first development phase for 45001 from back a couple years ago. There were hundreds of comments that were never dispositioned, and we've also learned a lot since the standards come out, and there's been a few surveys. So what we're doing is kind of some pre-work, and we're going through all of those comments, we're dispositioning, we've set up some task groups to go through all of those. And really what we want to do is have the pre-work done so that in a year or 2 or 3 or 4, whenever it is that the world decides now is the right time for version 2 of 45001, it doesn't then take us 4 years, 2 of which would be taken up by the work that we're doing now. We'll have a bit of a running start for when we're ready to go.
Thank you, Troy. I think that's very helpful. There is some confusion that we are secretly revising the standard against people's wishes, and I do want to assure everybody we're not doing that. We are just doing some planning. And for those of you that use ISO 45001, you'll understand the importance of planning. Liani, would you like to talk a little bit more about the kind of activities that this task group is undertaking?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So as Troy mentioned earlier on, we are undertaking preliminary work, and as Sally pointed out, it's preliminary, and the work is to prepare for the future revision of 45001. And so within our committee, we have subgroups, and each of these subgroups are responsible for reviewing the comments. And then with the comments, there's an expectation for each of these to come with recommendations. And we will then develop those into text at future task group meetings and readiness for when the time comes. Now, our focus will be on the language that's being used, as we've recognized that generic language doesn't get the message across. And therefore, it is important that we make sure that we adopt explicit rather than implicit language. We'll also be looking to provide specific examples to help identify possible blind spots. If you think about the earlier examples, we used to have examples in earlier versions of the draft standard. However, we replaced these with a more generic wording in later iterations as we try to streamline the document. And obviously, as everything goes in the standard writers, we are doing our best to be able to learn and adjust our approach in order to ensure that the standards are right for all users. And certainly this will be our main aim, or part of the aim, as this part of the preliminary work for our task group.
Thanks, Liani. And it's worth mentioning, I think, to the same point I made a moment ago, that any text developed in this task group would just then be proposed as a new comment to any new working group that is set up to revise the standard. So it's just ideas. This is something we could use to tackle, for example, more explicit examples where we actually say, think about these types of people at this moment. As Liani said, there is evidence showing that unless we do that, people do get overlooked. And the whole purpose of 45001 is, of course, to protect every worker in every organisation from harm. So as Leonie said, we are always trying to improve. And to a degree, that's where you, the attendees today, come in. We need to hear from you. What's working? What's not working? What would you like us to do? How can we help? That's what we're here for. We're here to serve you. So let's have a look now at some of the other standards this technical committee is working on or has in its portfolio, because 45001, although our core standard, is only the start of the story. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to ask Vic to tell you a little bit about ISO 45002. As he mentioned, he led on the implementation guidance handbook for small businesses, which we prioritised and published in 2020. So we already have some guidance, Vic. Why do we need a full standard as well?
Right. Well, you know, we were so excited releasing 45001, but we quickly realized that we needed to focus on small organizations because, as most people know, they make up the bulk of our businesses out there. But they may have a little bit of a challenge picking up a new standard like this. So we developed a handbook to help them to understand how to get started, how to read the standard just a little bit. I have to say that we've always wanted to have an implementation guide as a companion to 45001, and that's 45002. It's much more comprehensive. It gets into not only examples, but interpretations of the requirements. And most importantly, it takes advantage of the experience we've had in the last now 4 years of implementing 45001 and some of the challenges we've heard, so we could help organizations to move forward with addressing some of these things so they can focus on improving OH&S performance. So in a way, it's a great compliment to the fact that we are reaffirmed for now 45001, but we have this other document that's going to help us to move forward with that.
Thanks, Vic. And it's fair to say, isn't it, in 45002, it uses examples of all sorts of sizes and types of businesses to help illustrate how different users can use it, whereas the handbook really does focus on the smaller end of the business landscape and possibly the less complex end. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We had to write it to the small organizations level of where they are with understanding what management systems are and OH&S management altogether. But this document on 45002 is a lot deeper. And as you said, it gets into more examples, but it applies across the board because we have 100 countries involved in our committees, and we want to make sure it addresses the needs of all these different nations around the world, as well as the different sizes of organizations, including larger organizations as well as the small ones.
Thanks, Vic. And I think, you know, you're really illustrating very well that it's very hard to write a generic standard because there is so much diversity out there in the world. So again, your feedback is very, very helpful because we don't know everything, even with experts from 100 countries involved in the conversation. It's very easy to overlook things. So one of our sayings in this technical committee is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So yeah, any standard. Go ahead.
Yeah. If I can add, is that even working in the US, we have our certain biases on how we do things, but we begin to quickly realize there's a lot to learn from our colleagues around the world. So making sure that we address all of those things and take those into considerations, it's been really beneficial for me as a professional, as well as somebody who wants to help write this standard.
Thanks, Vic. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Just to let you know where we're at with this standard, it's likely to publish towards the end of this year. It was approved by public consultation earlier this year or at the end of last year, and the comments received on the draft will be addressed this month, so that will be final revisions. And because it is almost inevitable that we will make some technical changes. It will go out for one last approval ballot, not to the public, but to all the national mirror committees, those 100 countries that Vic mentioned, all get to have a final look and go, yes, okay, we're okay with this, hopefully. We had a high level of approval at the last ballot, so we are expecting the same. So do look out for this standard towards the end of this year. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So another standard that we're currently working on is ISO 45004, which is tackling the rather thorny subject of performance evaluation in occupational health and safety. Horacio, you're one of the experts in this working group. We have a lot of lively discussions. Can you tell us why we need the standard and what are some of the big points we've been talking about?
Okay, thank you, Sally, for the question. You know that most organizations, even now, they monitor performance using 3 or 4 simple safety indicators related to incident rate, frequency rate, severity rate, and these indicators are really measuring the past performance of the organization. They measure what happened in the last reporting period, and now this standard 14,004 is trying to provide guidance to evaluate performance, to evaluate the OH&S performance in a wider perspective, using indicators that reflect the influence that the organization can have in the future results that are usually called leading indicators versus the lagging indicators that reflect what happened in the past. So I think that this is the key focus of this standard, that it is supposed to be a standalone document. It doesn't have to be implemented together with 45001, and it can be used by any organization with any level of maturity of OH&S management. Did I answer your question, Salim?
Beautifully, thank you, Horacio. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I'd just like to tease out a few more opinions from our other panelists on why is health and safety performance just so important? Horacio started that conversation for us. But I would like to come to Liani. You work for an accreditation body. That's a body that checks that the certification bodies are doing their jobs properly. From a certification and assessment point of view, why is performance evaluation so important?
From an assessment point of view, Sally, sorry, my sound's just gone a little bit funny there. From an assessment point of view, we recognise that it is important to provide guidance on health and safety performance, as without it, there's a real risk that companies will just consider the basic requirements, for example, you know, the standard bread and butter stuff, internal auditing and management review, without fully considering health and safety performance and the benefits that it could give. And when it is implemented properly, it does provide and give a lot of benefits to the organizations. It was mentioned earlier on about the smaller organizations, and it's specifically important when we look at these smaller organizations and we consider the smaller organizations which may not necessarily employ occupational health and safety specialists or have access to anyone that is even familiar with management system standards. So, you know, thinking about it, and we appreciate that the small organizations employ a substantial proportion of the global workforce. So it is absolutely imperative that we provide clear guidance on health and safety performance in order for our organizations to fully implement the requirements.
Thanks, Liani, and I think it's a very good moment to reassure our attendees that really the sole purpose of our technical committee is to protect people. It is to protect workers. It isn't to promote certification. Certification is something that works for some businesses some of the time, but it's not for everybody. The primary purpose is to help you get better at OH&S management so that you have less accidents and less injuries, less incidences of ill health. So I think what Liani is saying is really important, but it's not the whole picture. Vic, from a business point of view, why is performance evaluation so important?
Yeah, Sally, well, it's pretty simple because what we're trying to do is protect worker health and safety. And when we do that, then the business can focus on their work at hand, which is producing their products and services. So OHS performance is extremely important, and it's actually something we stress a lot of times actually in the 45001 standard itself. So the question is, how do you gauge OHS performance? And in the past, with a lot of organizations, we looked at things that are negative that have happened. Horacio has actually pointed this out. We look at the injuries, the illnesses, the fatalities, and those are things we're always trying to prevent. So when we look now at 45004, focusing on OHS performance, we're trying to get to the leading metrics, those things that will help us to manage those risks so those negative events don't really happen. So this really links to what the broader view of how organizations operate. They look at leading indicators and key controls, how they manage their business. We're actually doing the same with providing guidance on how we can do this. So as an example, we may be able to take advantage of not only the risks, but the opportunities, such as, let's take a look at the design phase of a new manufacturing activities and see if we can kind of build in health and safety as an integral part of the operations rather than an afterthought because an injury has occurred. So what kind of performance indicators that is in terms of participating on the front end of things are extremely important, and I think things that will be pointed out in the work that we're doing in this effort.
Vic, I just want to go a little bit deeper, if you don't mind. You've started talking about indicators, and Horacio also mentioned leading and lagging indicators. This working group has had a lot of discussion on indicators. We've talked about qualitative and quantitative, and I think Horacio may have words to say about this. We have talked about reactive and proactive. Can you just try and explain to our listeners today, in very simple terms, why the terminology is less important and what we call them, whether we call them indicators or metrics, as opposed to what we actually choose to measure and monitor?
Sure. Was that a question for me or for Horacio? For me? Yeah. So pretty simple then is that what we're trying to do is change the mindset or thinking. Quite honestly, throughout my career, and I mentioned that I've been in this business for 35 years, we've always been looking at how do we change our indicators, performance and outcomes. And the reality is we want to change that mindset so that you're really thinking about things that would be preventative more than reactive. So reactive is, as you mentioned, is we've had fatalities. Let's react to that. That's an indicator that something isn't working. Instead of focusing on that, let's focus on what can potentially occur and what we can do to manage those things. And those indicators about risk are really important in order to prevent those kinds of things from happening. So we don't talk about leading or lagging. Let's just change the mindset here. What are the outcomes that we want? We want to prevent things that are a negative outcome, like fatalities, injuries, and illnesses from occurring.
Thanks, Vic. And Horacio, is there anything you would like to add on this subject?
Vic is the expert. Sally, you are putting me in a compromise.
You do not have to say anything. I know you have opinions on indicators.
No, but anyway, we have some things to clarify, but we will do this within the working group. So I think that what Vic said was okay for me.
You're very diplomatic. I'm very impressed. If we could go to the next slide, please. Again, I'll just give you a little update on where we are at with this document. We are currently at working draft 4, which perhaps will give you an indication of just how wide our discussions have been. With every iteration of this document, people send in more comments. We look at those comments, we discuss them, we rewrite, and we start again, and we move forward. But with every iteration, it is slightly better and slightly better, and that is how we build consensus. It will go out, we are hoping, for public consultation to all of the national standards body by January 2023. So this is your opportunity, people on this call, to get involved. Go via your national standards body to get a copy of the draft, to read it and to submit your comments. We're looking for suggestions for improvement. We want to make sure any organisation can pick this up and use it and get benefit out of it. And particularly with regards to small businesses, we're very aware that in some organisations, the HR person is also the payroll person, is also the OH&S person, and they handle the marketing and they directly deal with their customers. We know that there's not health and safety expertise in every organisation, but there are health and safety risks in every organisation. So if you all can take a read, put in some comments and let us know if it is doing its job, that's really, really useful. Letting us know what isn't understandable is just as important as letting us know if we've missed anything. One of the other things we're really looking for comments on is a review to see, does it answer your questions on how you measure your performance evaluation on psychological health? We know that many organisations haven't really grasped how to do this yet. We published ISO 45003 last year, which is the guidance document on this subject. That's still free to read on the ISO website. So if you haven't seen it, please do go and have a look. There's things anybody can do to help improve how we manage psychological health and wellbeing at work. But this document needs to support that document. Okay, let's move forward. And I'm going to turn directly to Troy on this new standard we're writing, ISO 45006. Troy, you're leading this group. Vic is one of our key experts on this group, so I think there might be quite a lot of comments.
Thanks, Sally. So yeah, I'm actually really excited about this this standard, and I've been really enjoying the technical committee and the conversations that we're having at the meetings. Just a bit of background, of course, and we're going to talk a little bit more about 45001 or 45005, I should say, which was a standard that was we put out quite quickly that specifically dealt with risks around COVID. We then had a discussion that said, okay, well, you know, COVID's going to go away. And for everybody that's listening, I hope wherever you are in the world, COVID is at least in retreat and is going away, although we all know it's not gone yet. But we've learned a lot about dealing with infectious disease, especially communicable infectious disease in the workplaces. So the COVID standard, the COVID 45005 is a fantastic document, but wasn't really applicable to a whole lot of the other infectious diseases that are out there. So we wanted to take our learnings and our process from that, and kind of while we were all together and while we were while we were moving in the right direction, say, okay, let's go do a general standard. Let's do a general infectious management of infectious disease guideline, so that after we get out of COVID, and you know, obviously people are very COVID fatigued. Nobody wants to talk about infectious disease anymore, but we really have to. We have just learned so much about, you know, obviously the prevention of COVID, but the prevention of all sorts of other infectious diseases. And again, whether they are communicable diseases or whether they are not communicable diseases, what can your organization do to be prepared for that next outbreak, either the next global pandemic or the next outbreak locally, or even just considering, can you do better around the illnesses that are endemic to your area of the world generally? So really what the guideline is it's a bit of a roadmap for how organizations can manage the risk and hopefully prevent exposures to infectious disease. So the first step, as with many of our standards, of course, we need to identify the hazards, and in this case, of course, is what are the potential the potential illnesses that could impact your workers, but also impact the function of your organization. If, for example, we have a really bad flu season and you lose, 30% of your staff to a bad flu, what does that do to your operation? What are your considerations? How can we prevent that from occurring? So we determine which illnesses could impact the organization. We determine what those actual illnesses could do to your workers. Then we look at, what are the right controls? How do we prevent exposure? And if we can't prevent exposure, how do we at least take additional measures within the workplace to ensure that we minimize the impact if the illness should happen to make its way into the workplace? And then, of course, the rest of the standard is very much, it has a lot of the features that one would be familiar with if you've used 45,001. So, commitment of leadership, delegation of authority, consultation and participation of the workers, which is incredibly important for all aspects of health and safety, of course, having those who do the work involved in the processes, ensuring effective communications about what the organization is doing, and then the continual review and improvement processes, because we're always trying to learn, and with every unfortunate exposure or outbreak within the workplace, we should learn and adapt and do a bit more. So that's kind of where we are, and we've been working on this for about 18 months, and we've had a few versions go out to the mirror committees, and Sally will talk a bit more about exactly where we are when we get there in a few moments.
Brilliant, thank you, Troy. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to explore with our panel a bit more. Troy's touched on it already, on why infectious diseases remain important even as, fingers crossed, the pandemic is put behind us and put into our past rather than our present. Vic, can you give us an idea of the kind of diseases businesses need to be aware of and think about, and that they can take action around, please?
Sure, and if I could just start with something that Troy mentioned, is we've never seen a document like this before that gives you broad guidance in terms of recognizing infectious diseases and what you have to do to put in place controls to manage this, to prevent infections to workers. One of the companies I started off with in my career was a biomedical facility. And when you're in that type of a research environment, you kind of already know that there are infectious diseases. We're doing animal research, so brucellosis, for instance, was something we would focus on. But there's this realization that every organization really needs to consider the potential for infectious diseases and the impacts on their workers. So it's just not the clinical environments or the research environments, because in these areas, for instance, you could start off with, and you might already know this, Legionella in our water systems from our cooling towers, for instance, or it might be black mold, Stachybotrys, that you might be affected by the mycotoxins that it releases there. So there may be situations like that, but there also are your food establishment settings, Salmonella or E. coli that may cause dysentery. If you're looking at people who have to work out in the field, like our postal delivery persons, you may be thinking about rabies or perhaps Lyme disease that is transmitted by ticks. But everybody is also concerned about what I'll lump into as travel health. So we send workers all around the world, if not locally. We have to be concerned with things that are maybe endemic to the area. So for example, malaria, if we travel to those countries, it could be the other mosquito-borne viruses such as chikungunya or the Zika virus, food and water sanitation and quality. And the other thing that we've learned through COVID-19 is this whole issue of making sure we're addressing what is not necessarily in the work environment initially, but the public health issues like COVID-19. We're familiar with seasonal influenza and the fact that we don't want somebody who's sick to come into the work environment and cause infections, because that affects not only the worker, but productivity of the organization as well. Even as a run-up into SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, we were concerned with avian influenzas, swine flu, Ebola, first version of SARS, MERS, all of these things are really kind of important because even though they didn't reach the level of a COVID-19 locally, these were all issues that impact potentially workers in the workforce. We have to be concerned about the different routes of transmissions from mosquitoes or bloodborne pathogens. Perhaps it's emergency responders and you're looking to control infections to HIV, AIDS, or it could be hepatitis. So whether or not you're considering injection or inhalation or animal bites, all of these things are really important considerations, but not necessarily top of mind when you think about occupational risks, because there are all different avenues and it takes a little bit longer for these things to develop than some of the acute issues that we deal with in the normal health and safety environment.
You gave us a lot of information there, Vic. Thank you very, very much. I mean, you guys have been training me throughout the development of this document, so I understand what you are saying. And I think actually the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic means that we all understand more about infectious diseases than we did prior to 2020, perhaps. But it's still a very specialist subject, right? And again, we know that most organizations aren't specialists. So I'm going to come to Horacio for a view on whether we are managing to write a document which is understandable by people who aren't Vic, ordinary people in their workplaces. What do you think, Horacio? Are we managing to get there?
So I am one of the ordinary people. Yes, it's okay. So, sorry, Vic, I understood you. Just I wanted to say something very minor, but just to say that the standard does not give technical advice on any individual disease. It just gives advice on the management related to the different types of diseases, but does not provide technical advice on any specific disease. The text, I think that is very good in the sense that it's very helpful for non-experts like me. I was most users of the standards. I represent the 99% of the future users of the standards. And as such, I can say that the text is very simple, uses simple words. And I think that the contribution of big experts like Vic help us to make the standard so good. Now, we have to bear in mind as well, as you said, Sally, that we all for 2 years have been used reading the newspapers, the TV, the neighbors. We all know what is a distance, masks, vaccination, lockdown. I mean, there is some terminology that has been already included in all our minds, not only for specialists. So that's why I find the language very simple to understand and very friendly. So I think that maybe that there are some few things to flow to correct, but I think that is very good standard and it will be a success. Now, I want to say something again, as in 14,004, this is a guidance standard, it's not a requirement standard. It is compatible with 45,001, but it can be applied by any organization with any level of management practices. Could be a certified company or a non-certified company, or a company that will only like to use this guidance, or would like to use this guidance and then will be tempted to go to a full management system. So I think that this will be a good paper, and I think that Troy and Victor are really one of the actors of this good paper, good document. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Horacio, and don't underestimate your own contributions to this, because I think sometimes people think that standards are written by experts for experts, but it's worth knowing that the range of people in our working group meetings, they are experts who've been nominated by their standards bodies from across the world, and they include people like me and Horacio, who act as those interested people who could be users. We're not experts when we enter into this work any more than the first-time reader of these standards. And that's one of the really big challenges of standards writers, to make sure they're technically correct, but that I can still understand them. So what are those really big discussion points in every working group meeting? And again, one of the reasons why we're really keen on public consultation. I think many people don't understand that if you do make a comment on a standard, some people don't comment on standards because they believe they're just written and that's it. We know best. This is what you should do. Go ahead and do it. That's not how standards are written. We are required to read each comment that is submitted to us and to consider it and whether that should impact the standard. Every single comment, even if we receive thousands of them, gets discussed, and that perhaps may explain why everything takes a little bit longer than perhaps we would like. ISO 45005 on COVID-19 was exceptional because the circumstances were exceptional, and our members of our technical committee really collaborated in the most fantastic way. And going back to the, is it good enough rather than perfect? That's the line we took to get it out so that we could provide assistance to people as soon as we could. This one will take a little longer. If we can go on to the next slide, please. We're currently at working draft 3. So one working draft behind the performance evaluation document, which has been going for a little longer than we have. The working drafts are again being shared with all the national mirror committees, the health and safety committees across the globe, and comments are being invited. We will be looking at comments, I believe it's next month on this, Troy, and then we will see another iteration. And if we can reach consensus, and I think there is a lot of willingness to reach consensus, to make sure we publish this document before people forget about infectious diseases, whilst it's still in our thinking and we remember how devastating they can be. Hopefully we will publish this document next year, but probably towards the end of the year. There are still processes we need to go through, and what we don't want to do is publish a standard which isn't good enough. So let's move on to our next topic, though it's all very related. What are we doing to make standards more inclusive and more accessible? We're dedicated to improving OH&S performance. We've already said that. And we've already touched on the fact that they don't always feel quite right or quite as accessible as they should for all of our users. And particularly that, I think it's something like 90% of organizations in the world are considered small or medium-sized. And they employ, I believe it's 70% of the global workforce. So if our standards aren't suitable for them, and particularly for the smaller organizations, which really do make up the bulk of our businesses, less than 10 employees, less than 5 employees, single people working as consultants, for example, or electricians, we need to protect everybody. But the language that we use is undoubtedly difficult. It's difficult for lots of reasons, including the fact that these documents do get translated into hundreds of different languages. So we have to be careful that they can be translated and that there's not too much room for misinterpretation. Horacio, you've always been a great advocate for making standards logical, simpler to read, short as possible. We've been trying, but are we making progress?
You are asking me difficult questions, Sally. I think that we consider ourselves standard writers. And so we write the standard, and we unintentionally write the standard thinking that the users will be standard writers. So we are experts and prepare a document for experts. But 99.9% of the users will not be experts. So we have to simplify the language. I think that TC 23 issued a policy statement, a very good piece of paper, very good, where it asked us to be simple, to be accessible, to be inclusive in when we write the text, and simplify the text. And I would like to give you some few examples. For example, if a requirement expects to ask the organization to evaluate performance, we say the organization shall establish, develop, establish, implement, control, maintain, and continually improve a process to evaluate performance. It's too complicated. We should say simply the organization shall evaluate performance, and that's it. So we have to simplify the language and do not use this develop, establish, implement, control, maintain, and continually improve. Or sometimes we use terms. For example, this is something that we may have to look at in 45006. We use term processes, procedures, controls, activities, measures, actions. They seem somehow similar. How can we translate them? Are we using them specifically for their meaning, or sometimes I think that we choose this word at random, and if we change activity to processes, things will work, will still work, or measures and action, these things still work. So there are many things, and if you let me, another one in the section 10.3 of all requirement standards say that the organization should implement, continually improve the adequacy, suitability, and effectiveness of a standard. I never understood after 30 years what is adequacy and suitability. And I have never seen an auditor auditing suitability and adequacy of the system. I never seen the finding on adequacy and suitability. So what do we mean by that? We keep them because it is easier to keep them than to erase them. But we have to delete them for the next time. So we have to simplify the language, not only for small company, for everybody. We have to simplify the language. I think that with the help of the TC 23 policy statement, it will help us to go in the right direction. We couldn't apply it completely in this standards have been developed. We try to, but they will be surely the next new documents or revised documents of the TC. We have to start, all of us, reading this policy document and commitment to follow it. Okay, this is what I wanted to say, Salim.
Thank you very much, Horacio. And you do have a passion for this, and it's one of the reasons you're so valuable in our work, because you're absolutely right. We do get used to using certain terms and certain phrases like adequacy, suitability, effectiveness, and they're great words. And the dictionary definition or the technical definition of these words, if you really study it, you understand what is said. But I think there is a really important point to remember is that we're all ever so busy, and people don't always take the time to look up every word in a sentence and make sure that they are doing exactly what that technical piece of writing is asking them for. So I hear you when you say that you don't think we'll be able to make it with the documents in development now, but I'm really asking for us all to work hard on that. And for when the comments come in from national standards bodies and users, for those users to say, can we simplify this? Why don't you just say this? Isn't this what you mean? Now, we may not be able to make it quite as simple as somebody suggests, but we may be able to make progress also. I want to come to Liani now, because not being on screen, we might forget about you, Liani, so we need you to shout out. Horacio has referred to this policy document, and it isn't just about simplification. It's also about initiatives we are making to make sure our standards are more inclusive and are more explicit. We mentioned it earlier, but what do we mean by it? What's the problem here, and what are we doing about it?
I think Russia sort of summed it up quite nicely, and sort of as have you. And I'm hoping that it has become quite apparent and clear as we sort of talk through the first couple of slides. You know, as a committee, we are very much committed to providing support and improve health and safety performance in organizations, all types and sizes, to guide those organizations to consider the need of all workers. And in doing so, having that aim to avoid the use of complex languages and use simpler languages, bearing in mind that most of the people that read the standard don't live in countries where English is potentially their first language, and also, you know, their reading capabilities may not be what it is in some of the other countries. So as a committee, we will look to ensure that, you know, we think about wording and requirements and recommendations, and ensure that it is easy to identify and it's not buried in additional wording. So whatever is in there is clear and is succinct. So to this end, we will certainly make sure that we do not add unnecessary burden by requiring non-critical documented information. I think something that did stood out in the past is we tended to write a standard, and when you read it, it does look like it requires a lot of documented evidence to be presented. So that is one of the things we focus on. Our aim will also be very much to the use of explicitly guiding organizations to think about the needs of workers who do not conform to an historical age, and also to consider the needs of women. Women are still very much overlooked in the workplace, and by mentioning and explaining this throughout the use of clever examples in the standard, it would allow us to address those issues. Care will also be taken when referring to gender, and we will focus on the use of words such as they and their, rather than using he or she, obviously, unless it refers explicitly to a woman. And then obviously, we will also look to ensure that we include examples that illustrate and or explain the types of health and safety considerations that's needed for specific types of workers, and we'll look to use standalone subclauses as part of the context to signpost diversity and inclusion in the standard. And then the intention for it is that these subclauses are then referred back throughout the documentation, thus ensuring that our documentation is more inclusive to what it has potentially been in the past.
Thanks, Liani. I think you make some really good points. And in one of our earlier sessions today, in the emerging trends in occupational health and safety management conversation, we were talking a lot about the scale of demographic change and migration. It's not just about aging populations, but there are risks there which get overlooked. We have a lot of older workers coming into the workplace, staying in the workplace, but also we have a hugely widening gap between the very youngest and the very oldest in an organisation. They don't have the same needs. So if we have generic systems, we're in trouble. There's a lot of people going to fall through the cracks. And somebody's already mentioned, Liani just mentioned literacy levels. Average literacy levels across the world are low. It doesn't matter which part of the world you go to, they're not high. But our documents, I think, have a reading age of about 343 or something at the moment. Most of us are never going to get there. We need to bring it right back down to the kind of language that an intelligent child would be able to understand, because that is our reading age in many, many places for many, many people. So the work that we're doing is very much focused on that. And I do see a question has come through. Does the panel think wording remains complex as the non-specialist user doesn't consider themselves experienced enough to comment on the draft? And I think that that's a really good question. If we're putting a very complicated document out and say, how can we make it better? Really, really difficult for you to do if you don't understand what it says. But that's partly coming back to what I was saying before of, please do open these You are all experts in your own right because you are experts in your context, for your business. Everybody who picks it up has some form of expertise. It might not be on infectious diseases, but we need you to be able to understand it and use it, or we're not doing our job properly. So even if your comment is, the whole of clause 6 makes no sense to me, please make it easier. Even that tells us that we need to do some more work. So please don't be put off by not being experienced or not being a specialist in a particular document. These documents, in our technical committee, we write documents for everybody. They are not written for experts in a field. We are not dealing with specific processes in nuclear physics. We're talking about management of your operations in your businesses. So, Troy.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Leonie.
If there's just something else I can add, and I was thinking about it whilst you were talking. Yeah, you know, we also need to appreciate that these standards need to be translated from English into other languages. And by the very nature, when we simplify the language and steer away from using complex language, we also further facilitate the translation of these standards into different languages, and thereby almost sort of lessen the burden in trying to figure out what it is saying, but it's not saying.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and certainly some of our commenters and experts in our working groups, one of the things that they do, Horacio has done himself, Horacio being a Spanish speaker, is say, we don't have a word for that in Spanish. And the English speakers are going, but it's the right word. And Horacio goes, can't translate it, find a different word. And that's really useful. So the more people from more languages that get involved, the better we get at that, and the more we understand, oh no, we can't use that word because you just can't translate it in X, Y, and Z language. And it's not always just Spanish. Let me iterate that. It's many languages, and of course we have experts in our groups from native English speaking countries, but I think Vic, Troy, and I do not speak the same language. And that in itself is interesting. There is not one English in the world any more than there is one Spanish. There's another question here, just before I come to you, Troy, about 45,001 and language, which is a slightly more complicated picture than perhaps for our other documents. An interesting comment. What is the committee doing to make sure that the document is protected from plagiarism? I don't know if anybody wants to pick that one up. If not, I will take it. Any volunteers? Firm shaking of heads. Well, what I would say is it's incredibly difficult for any plagiarism to sneak into a standard because we rewrite every sentence multiple times. And as a usual process in this technical committee, we will put together a seed document from scratch. We will write it from scratch before we go anywhere, a preliminary piece of work, which may use parts of our other documents, of our own documents, the ones that we own the property rights for, but they don't use other people's documents. It's a condition of working in the ISO environment that if you contribute any text or any diagrams, any figures, you must own the intellectual property rights for those and have permission to share them. Because once that document is published, that intellectual property belongs to ISO, not to you. So I hope that we do have everything in place to protect from plagiarism. But again, if anybody ever spots something that they're concerned about, let us know. Nobody is deliberately plagiarizing anybody's work. So if something slips through, despite our processes, we want to know about it so we can do something about it, please. Gosh, there's an awful lot of questions coming through now about language. I would agree with the person who has raised the question about ease of reading, as this is an issue not just in BSI or ISO standards, but in anything produced by regulators in the UK for a starting point. This scares people off from accessing information and increases the number of people working at risk by not accessing helpful information. It's a really good point, and it emphasises why we're doing this. So, Troy, we are doing preliminary work on ISO 45001. Language is an issue with management system standards, but would you like to explain to our audience why this is a little bit more challenging than it might be in our guidance documents?
Sure. So thanks for that. And I really agree with everything that's been said so far, because the workers that I represent within our union, 75% of all of our locals are in businesses that are less than 50 people. Almost 70% of them, between 65 and 70% of my membership are women. So we really do need to think about the people that we're writing for when we develop these standards. Now, there's a bit, as Sally alluded to, there's a bit of a technical glitch within the system, I'll call it, in that there are master documents that come from ISO that do guide how management standards must be written. And without getting too technical about it, we can't really change that text. We can write around it. We can add simplified explanatory text. We can add additional clauses that make the point, but those words must appear in the standard. So we don't have as much wiggle room in the 45001 as that is the management standard, whereas the rest of the documents are guidance on how you can apply the management standard to the specific topic. So for example, for infectious disease. So that doesn't say we're giving up though. And, and this is where I want to make my plug. We're just getting underway. We haven't even had our first full, we had our first technical meeting where we introduced each other, but we haven't even had our first meeting where we've started to look at the work for TG6, for the group, for the technical group that's going to be doing the work for 45001. So if there's anyone who's still looking to get involved, go through whatever standards body you have in your country, and please come on board, because we have a lot of things to consider and a lot of things to discuss. So please bring your expertise. So that's my pitch. What we're doing within the committee. So as we mentioned, we have a number of subgroups. We're dividing all the work up into subgroups, and we have two subgroups. One that's dedicated to reviewing the document through the lens of the small business, small and medium enterprise view. How can these standards be interpreted from a business that has less than 20 people, 20 to 50 people? When they read, as Horatio mentioned, or I think someone mentioned, 20 different places where they have to record information. Well, how can somebody who, as Sally mentioned, the HR person is in charge of hiring, in charge of health and safety, in charge of discipline, in charge of payroll, and now they got to go find 20 different things for for documentation for their health and safety system. Can we modify that? And then, because we didn't want to shortchange any of the importance of the review, we have a whole other committee that's going to be looking at the inclusion. And have we written the text in such a way as to ensure that we are saying what we mean and not just implying it? So when we say you have to consider the needs of women, you have to consider the needs of workers who have been in the workplace longer, or for that matter, new workers, not even just young workers, but workers that are new to the organization. So we really have to consider each clause and say, if a new worker was to read this, what would they think? Would they have any idea? Because Sally said this is at a 300-year-old level. I agree. It doesn't really matter how well you speak the language, how good you are at reading. Standards have their own flow and their own way. And I've been writing standards now for 11 years, and it took me 5 or 6 just to get a sense of it kind of clicked one day for me. Like, oh, that's what they mean. That's what they, and it really is. It's complicated, and it's as Horatio mentioned, a lot of times unnecessarily complicated because we started with a document that requires to have so many words in it, and all of the documents have come from that. So even in Canada, we started with a document, and all of our documents started from one that was complex. So we're not perfect. We're learning. We're getting better with every iteration. Hopefully, we make the documents more clear, more accessible, and I really do want to encourage more people to get involved because they're again, it's a learning process to be on the committee, but we learn from every single person who comes on and contributes to the committee. It helps us learn and make better standards.
You're absolutely right, Troy. And it's not just the people who come on the committee, it's the people who send us questions via our website and say, what does this clause mean? What am I meant to do? All of this helps us. It helps us learn. It helps us improve so that we can help you better. And we are going to talk about the future of management system standards generally in a moment, and perhaps what might be able to happen in the future. Again, to Horatio's point, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but we're hoping to make some changes in the long term to make the situation better. So we'll come to that in a minute, but just before we do, if we can go on to the next slide, please. I just want us to discuss a little bit more about the different challenges across the world. Vic mentioned we have 100 countries involved in our work, whether they're participating or observing. They are there, they can comment, and they are interested in our work. Of course, that means we're still missing quite a lot of countries, 70-ish. I don't know, the number of countries seems to change periodically, but there's quite a lot still not involved in our work, and the challenges do vary a great deal. Vic, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about what we're doing about that in the TC, how we're doing our best to try and make sure everybody's voice is heard?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Sally. It's a really great one, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to give credit to our chair, Martin Cottam, as well as you, Sally, for thinking about having what we call these regional representatives. Now, in the 45001 standard, there is emphasis on making sure the whole of the organization is involved in managing health and safety. And the concept is very similar in that we want to make sure that everybody, all 100 participating countries or observing members of the committee, is actively participating, and we're getting their views in developing these standards. There are 9 regions, so it's strategically zoned around the world to make sure that there's coverage for these members of the committee itself. They help ensure that we are not dominating just a few countries in developing these standards, or that particularly those who are English speaking, that we're taking into account all of the input and the experience and the needs of those other members of our committee. It provides a forum when we have these regional representatives to have local discussions for input and committee operations and initiatives, how well these standards are working, what kind of input that really needs to put in, what kind of emphasis there is a way to share how they're rolling out these standards, the challenges that they're facing, and quite frankly, feed that back into the leadership team so that we're recalibrating, readjusting how we're developing these standards and meeting the needs of not just 20 countries, but all 100 countries, and even those that are not currently part of our committee right now. In fact, one of the initiatives for these regional representatives is to reach out for countries that are not participating with TC 283, our committee, but to recruit them to see if they want to participate so we could, again, take their input and help them manage occupational health and safety in their regions as well. So making sure that we have that collective input is extremely important to us. And again, I think it's really brilliant because it follows the same concept of making everybody has a say And when we make these standards, it works for everybody as best as it possibly can.
Well, we're very keen on worker consultation and participation in ISO 45001, Vic. So I think you're absolutely right. If we can't do the same thing in our technical committee, we're falling down. We need to demonstrate that we believe what we're talking about. Horacio, would you mind just mentioning very briefly, because we are beginning to come to the end of our session now, about the group that we have formed to support developing countries?
Yes, Sally. There is a group called DCCG, Developing Countries Contact Group, that the idea is to gather concerns and needs of these countries and to put them on the table of discussion in the TC. Somehow, it's a personal opinion, Sally, I see some overlapping with the regional groups that that mentions Vic. So I think that the TC will have to reconsider the connection between both groups, but they are an active group. I think that the question of the developing countries, it cannot be solved, will not be solved only by TC 2A3. I think that ISO had to do something to push countries to establish national standards body, to establish mirror committees, and to get all stakeholders on board and to understand the ISO processes. The NSB have to form these mirror committees and to prompt their members to join our groups or our TC. And the experts is also part of the solution or part of the problem. The experts should actively participate. And this is just to transmit, to convey a personal experience. It is not easy to be a non-English speaking people in this kind of groups. It is not easy. And at the very beginning, 30 years ago, I was quite embarrassed, a bit embarrassed or inhibited to speak. I usually found a very friendly environment, but anyway, it's not easy to hold a meeting and to speak and to discuss and to write in a foreign language. So experts have to participate. We have to push, or ISO had to push national standards body to nominate experts, or the TC had to push the national standards body to nominate experts, but experts that participate actively. Because if not, if a country does not participate, the only thing that they have left is to translate the standard. If they participate passively, they just listen what's going on. Maybe that they understand a bit more, but they will not influence the text. The only way of influencing the text is participating actively, and have to overcome that barrier of the language. I know that my English is not good. It's not good, but I can manage. I am decided to speak, so you will know. You know that.
Horacio,
So,
your English is very good now.
I think that the final conclusion is just participate actively.
Yeah,
It's
and sorry to interrupt you, Horacio. You've raised some really interesting points that I just wanted to comment on. The overlap between the regional representatives and the developing countries coordination group. We are asking all of our regional representatives to sit within the DCCG so that their efforts are coordinated, not least because we should be using a developing countries coordination group to enable countries with more mature systems and more mature economies to support the developing countries. This is all about knowledge exchange and sharing competence, raising competence together, working together to do it. That is the beauty of the global community that we have here. And your language point, Horacio, so well made, particularly in an age when we really are trying to be better at inclusivity. And yet we're saying, yeah, we're very inclusive, but only if you speak English. Now, one of the things that has happened recently, the very first thing of its type in our committee, is we held our first Spanish speaking only event. And Martin Cotton, the chair, and I attended this event. And Horacio knows I have been trying to learn Spanish for the last few years, and I'm still no good. I'm a lot worse than Horacio is at English, that's for sure. And Martin has no Spanish. So we experienced what it is like to be in that environment.
We will invite you to our mirror committee then.
Okay, I'll come and practice my Spanish. But just as you were saying about active participation and speaking up and the language barrier, right now, I would be too frightened to speak in Spanish, even if I could follow some of the conversation. So I understand, and it's something we need to keep working on. And I think this is something where, again, any ideas anybody has of how we can make this better so that it is more inclusive. We do have a Spanish translation task force, which is great. At least we're getting our standards translated into a Spanish that all of the Spanish-speaking countries can use. And other committees have an Arabic translation task force. We currently have 2 people who do that function for us, but maybe that can grow. But, you know, there's lots of challenges here, and we are trying to address them. But again, audience, if you have any ideas, share them with us. We're very, very open to working out how we can do this better. You also mentioned mirror committees, Horacio, and Troy, I wanted you to just say just a few words, please, on the importance of national mirror committees. Horacio said ISO should do more to help within developing countries and stuff, and there are initiatives there, and there is funding there. There is capacity building funding. So if it's something you're interested in, look it up on the ISO website or email us and we'll put you in touch. But Troy, if you could talk more generally about national committees.
Yeah, so I don't even know how many countries do and don't have mirror committees. I know not enough do, and I know that even for the ones that do, there is tremendous variability between the size. So I think like the American mirror committee has like 150 people. You know, we have you know between 30 and 40 in ours, but there are ones that are less than a dozen people. What the mirror committees are really good for, and this is what Horacio was talking about, building capacity. So you may not feel as though you can come to a full ISO TC meeting and speak for whatever reason because you don't think that you're technical enough. Although I can tell you probably are. Maybe it's a language concern. The mirror committee is a place where you can go and learn and develop. I learned a lot of almost everything I know about ISO. I learned at my mirror committee in Canada. From listening to the people who had come to the ISO meetings, and they tell us about the things. So they're great capacity building tools for your country to teach people who may not feel like they're quite ready to step up to the big game and come to a full ISO meeting. They're excellent for that. They're also really important because it helps to develop your country's positions for when we do have committees that are limited in participation. So right now, none of our committees are limited, but at some point when we actually do reopen and review 45,001, we can't have every country sending 10 people. So the delegations become limited, in which case the mirror committees are where the countries will decide what their positions are on various things and make sure that they get reflected at the meeting. So they're good for that. But I think the more important role is the development of the skills and development of the future standards developers that come forth for the ISO committee. So I also encourage folks to, if you don't have them, set them up. And as Sally mentioned, there are resources available. So please use those resources.
Thanks, Troy. We are into the final 10 minutes of our session today, and we've got a really big topic on the next screen. So this is a time when I'm going to say, brief answers, please. And I need to tell it to myself too, because I just want to introduce the fact that there is an ISO task force at the moment undertaking work looking at the future of management system standards, looking at language, looking at usability, looking at just how many there are and if that's working for our users. I'm involved in leading that with our TC283 chair. The two of us are leading it together. I think partly we were given the job because we were the ones complaining about it. It's often the way. We ended up being volunteered. But so to the point that Troy made earlier, that we are given text that we have to use in a management system standard like 45001, this is part of what we want to look at. It's very difficult for us who are so familiar with standards to always know what user issues really are. So that's what we're trying to find out at the moment and do something about. I'm going to come to you very briefly, 1 minute each-ish, please. Liani, from a certification and accreditation point of view, is there something you would like to be improved in the ISO management system standard landscape?
Yes, I would like to see a standard that is more simplified and that gives clear direction and avoid using generic phrases such as appropriate, as appropriate, or if necessary, because from an accreditation point of view, it is so difficult to assess something that is as appropriate. What does it mean? So simplicity for us will be key without losing importance of the clause, of course.
So simplicity and less vagueness, I think I'm getting from you. Is that right?
That's absolutely spot on.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, Horacio, 1 minute maximum, please. Is there anything differently you would like to see management system standards doing so they can be more useful?
We have discussed this issue during this meeting. So I would say a key issue that I think that is missing is that whatever we change in the management system standards, we have to measure the success of that change. And we don't know how to measure. There are no indicators who is going to say that the standard is better than before. We are not going to say to ourselves that we were clever enough to develop a good standard. So we need a way of, and before it used to be the number of certificates, but maybe that there are many organizations that do not certificate, and even so they implement the standard. So how can we identify those organizations that identify partially or totally the standard and they are using it? So a key issue after any changes that could be introduced is how to measure the success, how to measure the performance. So we have to apply the principles we include in the standard to ourselves, and it is not enough to prepare a good standard. We have to prove that it is good with the users. I don't know how we will do that, but it's quite a challenge.
Thank you, Horacio, because this is part of the work that the task force has. We have spent the last 5 months looking for evidence, examining evidence, discussing from as many different angles as we can get it, what's good, what's bad, what does work, what doesn't work, what could be improved. And we are hoping that we will have a stakeholder webinar, public webinar, on this, perhaps towards the end of September, so that we can get more views and perhaps run some polls, do some surveys in that, to see if the findings of our task force actually match up with users' views. We're going to send out our report for comment. So again, if you see it coming around, read it, comment it. Let us know if we're on the right track or not, because what we do not want to do, to Horacio's point, is make recommendations for changes that you don't want to see. We want to make sure that any recommendations that are put forward are genuinely going to help. Okay, Vic, there is some talk of developing a simpler, shorter set of overarching requirements for all management system standards, recognizing that organizations tend to have one management system, not 50. Do you think this would be welcome in the type of organisation you worked for?
Yeah, the simple answer, and I can answer this in 2 seconds, is yes. It would definitely be. You know, when I actually looked at 45,001 years ago when we released it, 50% of it is common text, but you can't identify what the common text is. But yet organizations are putting together combined management system like environmental health and safety, and they have to figure that piece out, and it makes it a little bit more challenging. So absolutely, we can somehow find a way to highlight these things so that we can make it easier for organizations to adopt. It's a resounding yes.
Well, that's encouraging. So the idea at the moment, one of the ideas, there's many ideas floating around, but one of the ideas is to reduce that core text to something very short and not have it repeated in any other standard, but actually to have the specific extra requirements, for example, for health and safety, put into a template which joins onto it. So it's very clear what the core standard is. And then if you have extra requirements in your organisation that you meet for occupational health and safety, they would be listed, and so would the environmental ones, and so would the quality ones under each relevant part. So if you think that's going down the right track, that's really good news. But again, give us your ideas at any point, we need it. Troy, you work with all sorts of different stakeholders. Are these the kind of things that you're hearing? Do people understand the difference between the different types of management system standards? Because there are two main types of standards, one for requirements, one for guidance, but there are 5 different types of guidance management system standards. And there are, of course, also management standards, for example, for risk or social responsibility. We are getting the impression there's a lot of confusion out there. Do you think that's right?
Like Vic, short answer is yes, there is tons of confusion. People who I sit on technical drafting committees in Canada don't understand the difference at the ISO level, what these things are and what a guidance document is versus a management system standard. And is the question, are there too many? I don't think there's too many. I think standards get developed based on the need for the standard to exist. We have 11 in our management standard systems for health and safety alone, all relevant, all important. But what I tell the people who are asking for my advice is focus on the one that you need now. Don't, you get that system in, get that well running, get that in place, then focus on the next thing. You can't learn to drive a unicycle and juggle and breathe fire all at the same time. You have to do these things one at a time and get good at them before you go on to the next one.
Thanks, Troy. We are completely out of time, so although I would like to spend a lot more time talking about this, and I really encourage our attendees to send us your thoughts, give us some feedback on this. What would you like to see? We do need to come to an end. And I do have one question I haven't answered yet about if any of the standards can be found free of charge. It can be an issue to get an employer to pay for a standard. We understand that. So please go onto the ISO website, onto the COVID-19 pages. You will at the very least be able to read ISO 45003 on psychological health and safety at work, ISO 45005 on working safely during the COVID-19 pandemic, and when we put things out for public comment, they are free to read. You can't download them and print them, but you can read them. So please look out for those public consultations made through mirror committees. And if you ever have an issue finding something in your country, get in touch with us and we'll see what we can do to help. We can't give you standards, but we can find ways of helping you understand what their content is. Please do get involved, have a look on our website, email us, come to more of these events, let us know how we can help you. Thank you so much for joining us today, to all of our attendees, and of course to our brilliant panel. Troy, Vic, Horacio, Liane, you've all been great. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope everybody else has too. And we will be doing this all again in November. So if you have any ideas on what we should be talking about next time, let us know, and we hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.